Good morning, everyone. Thank you, MEI, for inviting me to moderate this book talk. My name is Patricia Karam. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and also a senior advisor with the American Task Force for Lebanon. I wanted to start by saying a few words and then introduce our author and our discussant today. When 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in the Beirut port ignited a blast on August 4, 2020, killing more than 220, injuring around 7,000 others, and really destroying buildings, the Lebanese were thrown into shock in the face of a catastrophe that could and should have been avoided. The available evidence shows, according at least to Human Rights Watch, that multiple Lebanese authorities were at a minimum criminally negligent under Lebanese law in their handling of the cargo, creating unreasonable risk to life. Families of the victims continue to gather since at Lebanon's main harbor to keep discussing the case or keep it in the limelight so that the Lebanese authorities don't forget about it. Meanwhile, this investigation into what is perceived as the biggest crime in Lebanon's history has really been deflected by the country's entrenched sectarian political parties. Administrative interference in particular has derailed productive tracks of investigation, leading to the investigation suspension in December 2022. In January 2023, Lebanon's top prosecutor, Ghassan Ouaidat, illegally ordered the release of all suspects detained and really revoked at least one arrest warrant. This marked yet again the failure, another failure to disrupt the system of impunity that pervades Lebanese politics, and really underscored the alarming reality that the judicial system operates in the service of the authorities who have a vested interest in truth never seeing the light of day. But this hasn't stopped activists from staging gatherings and carrying out activism to raise the case in public space. Dozens of Lebanese and international organizations, along with survivors and victims' relatives, many led by women, connected to today's panel, have been calling for the establishment of an international independent investigative mission into the violations that related to the Beirut explosion, to no avail. Now, fighting impunity in Lebanon is difficult, given how widespread and deep-rooted corruption is in Lebanese society and politics. And today, Dalal Maawad will be discussing with us the findings of her book and the importance of pursuing accountability through the lens of women by documenting their testimonies and examining the various human rights violations they face, the way women carry the weight of injustice, both on the domestic and the national socioeconomic one. Nicholas Nassar will provide commentary on the larger context of impunity in Lebanon and ways that one may disrupt or combat it. But first, before giving the floor to our speakers, let me introduce them. Dalal Maawad, an author of our book today, is an independent award-winning Lebanese journalist based in Paris who works as freelance producer for CNN and part-time journalism professor at Sciences Po. Maawad was a senior producer with the Associated Press based in Lebanon when twin blasts rocked Beirut on August 4, 2020, and she extensively covered the explosion and its aftermath, as well as Lebanon's financial crisis since 2019. Nick Nassar is a U.S. Lebanon Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution, and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. His work focused on international humanitarian and relief interventions in fragile and conflict settings, democratization, U.S. foreign policy, and Middle Eastern politics. Notably, with regards to this panel, most notably, in the aftermath of the Port of Beirut blast on August 4th, he was part of the World Bank's core team responsible for designing the Beirut Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, the primary evidence-based study to assess the damages caused by the Port of Beirut explosion and the country's recovery and reconstruction needs. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dalal. Dalal, thank you for being with us today. I read the book. It was incredibly moving. But for the audience's sake, can you tell us a bit about it? What is it about? What does it cover?
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the Middle East Institute for having me. My book is entitled All She Lost, and it's the story of the Beirut blast, but also Lebanon's recent and unprecedented collapse told through women's stories. It's a women-led narrative. And I always say that the she in All She Lost not only refers to Lebanon's women, it refers to Lebanon as a nation. So what our nation has lost, and to Beirut as a city, what Beirut has lost on that day and has lost in the past few years since the onset of the crisis. I was in Beirut, outside of Beirut, actually, on that day, but I covered the explosion and its aftermath, as you mentioned, with the Associated Press. And throughout my journey as a reporter, covering that story, definitely the hardest and the most difficult story I have covered as a journalist, because it felt so personal. I met incredible women, and they were really powerful storytellers. They had different stories. They were survivors, all of them, and not just Lebanese women. This book includes the stories of also migrants, refugees, Syrian refugees, and some foreign women as well. So it's about women in Lebanon more than just Lebanese women. And I realized throughout my interviews in the aftermath covering the blast that they were not just survivors of the Beirut blast, but survivors of endless cycles of violence throughout Lebanon's modern history, that they, on top of the economic crisis that they were surviving, on top of what they lost on August 4th, they were also survivors of Lebanon's patriarchal and discriminatory laws. And we can go deeper into this later on. There were specific stories related to that. Refugees were already marginalized and suffering from discrimination before the explosion, and they became even more vulnerable after that. Same for migrant workers. And so I bring all these stories together, and the Beirut explosion is their common thread, but really put together, they tell the story of Lebanon's recent collapse and Lebanon's recent modern history. That's the macro picture. The beginning is very heavy on the Beirut explosion, but as you go on, and as you probably know because you read the book, it becomes less and less about the explosion and more about the collapse, the condition of women in Lebanon's recent history, and this culture of impunity that they have to live with for decades, not just now, and have to fight against, and how all of them really are fighting for a justice that is just so elusive and so evasive in a country like Lebanon.
Thanks, Dalal. Now, when you talk about how you set out to gather testimonies, right, to uncover to a certain extent the truth about what happened, but also the truth about Lebanon in some ways, if I hear you right, why did you choose to explain to us a little bit why you chose to tackle it from the standpoint of women, and what kind of methodology? I mean, talk to us a little bit about the methodology in the book.
Yeah, I get this question a lot because at the end of the day, all of the Lebanese are survivors of these two crimes and of what's happening. And when you read the book, it's really the overall story of Lebanon and the Lebanese suffering. But I chose to tell it from the perspective of women specifically, because I think women don't get to write history, not just in Lebanon, not just in the Middle East, but overall in the world. Although they're active players and have played prominent roles in throughout history, and it's because we don't write history from their perspective that we don't really know that they were at the forefront of so many historical events, and that includes Lebanon. So I thought it's about time that, this modern history is written from their perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, I've noticed throughout my career covering the Middle East that women, Arab women, were the most powerful storytellers. They gave me access and they shaped their stories in a very different way than men. And I think the reason is they rarely have a safe space. So they have a voice. It's just they don't have a space to use that voice, a safe space. So once you give them access and they trust you, and which was the case in this book, but also in previous reporting that I've done, really, they are incredible storytellers. There was also a personal reason behind this. When I met all of these women, I was reminded of my own grandmother. In 1958, my grandfather was killed in a massacre in my hometown. I come from Zghebta in the north of Lebanon. It was a revenge killing a few months after the well-known Mizyara massacre. And my grandpa had nothing to do with that massacre, but he happened to be from the Ma'awad family, which were involved in the massacre, and someone from the opposed family, really, it was like tribes and family clans, came and shot him. And I lived my life, and my grandma lived with us, seeing a very bitter woman who spent her life seeking justice, and she never got that justice because the man who killed my grandpa never served his prison sentence, and the reason is he was protected by a politician. And so she was very bitter, and she never found that peace. And I saw that in the women that I met, that they were really fighting for justice, and that justice, as I said, is so evasive. They've been surviving so much violence because of the prevalence of impunity in Lebanon. So they tell me about the civil war, they tell me about wars with Israel, political assassinations, etc., and etc. And fast forward, I'm talking about my grandmother in 58, more than 50 years on, not much has changed when it comes to impunity in Lebanon. And, a lot of people who should be held accountable are not. So for all of these reasons, and the fact that these women really are survivors of not just the Beirut explosion, but so much more, including discrimination and patriarchal laws, I thought that a women-led narrative was necessary. Now, the second part on the methodology, just very briefly, not to bore our audience, I did not use a typical journalism reporting methodology, in the sense that I did not have a detailed set of questions when I sat down with these women. I had one or two very general questions. I used the methodology of oral history, where you sit down and you ask a very general question, and then you have the interviewee lead you. And these women sometimes were answering one question for an hour or two. And they were taking me to various themes that I did not necessarily want to go to. So I let them kind of own the interview. I let them tell me what they wanted to tell me. And this is how a lot of themes you will read about came out very naturally, including, surviving discrimination, previous bouts of violence that, they wanted to talk about. I did not ask them about the Civil War, for example. This came out naturally in our conversations. And I went back to see many of these women again and again. So I have recorded hours of interviews with most of them. And I went back to see some of them more than once, as I mentioned. And then at the end, when you read the book, you'll see also that it's a mix of reportage and narration, but also the chunks of narrations that I use from the interviews are not desensitized, not censored. This is where oral history is. So it's chunks of narration as is, often translated, unfortunately, because they speak in Arabic and the book is in English. But you have to stay very truthful to what they say, and it's a challenge. It's not easy. I was not used to this. Even if a woman, for example, says something and it's a mistake, sometimes I didn't even correct it. I kept it as is. I would add context myself. So my voice is in there. My interaction with these women is in there. And there are two historical chapters in the book about the recent history of Lebanon and the modern history of Lebanon. They're short, concise, meant for an international and foreign audience. So it might be a bit oversimplified, but to explain to a non-Lebanese audience, a bit about our history and the events that these women mention through the interviews and their chapters.
Yeah, thank you, Dalal. That's very useful. I wanted just to drill down a bit on the question of, you mentioned that, sorry, you mentioned, you talk about the cycle of violence that women are sort of caught in. And, again, the blast sort of, or your approach to covering the blast kind of exposed a bit what women did and how the blast maybe affected them at that moment. But how does it, I mean, given that we know that the marginalization, what we know of the marginalization that women face, what did it tell us beyond kind of the broader issues of psychological limitation or psyche limitations in Lebanese society, for lack of a better word? What does it tell us about the potential for changing the situation of women and altering the cycle of violence that they are subjected to?
Yeah, so when I talk about violence and them covering endless cycles of violence, as I said, we're talking about a wider definition of violence. So we're talking about economic violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, violence that is structural and institutional in religious courts. This comes out a lot. And I describe the women as survivors, and I'm very keen on this terminology. There are stories in there of women who really did heroic work on August 4th and show a lot of stamina in their actions on that day and beyond. There are also women survivors who've lost loved ones and yet managed to turn their loss and grief into meaningful action. So, for example, the mother of Cristel El Adem, who started the Cristel Adem Foundation, helping children in schools, Lebanese children in schools. There's Tracy and Paul, which are known to the wider public because of their fight for justice, but also their daughter Alexandra, who is killed. They have a Christmas initiative every year. There are a lot of examples, of women who, despite everything they've lost and Lebanon has taken from them, are still fighting. But there's something in the book, and I'd like to mention it here, where I talk about the myth of resilience. I would not like to call and describe these women as resilient, because I think they're not resilient. And this book is proof to that. When you really do not heal from traumas, and it's one trauma that piles on top of another trauma, and you are triggered by previous traumas when you survive a recent event, you can see that these women are not necessarily moving to something that's better. They are just adapting, adjusting. They're in a survival mode, very much. They're adjusting to a life of subsistence, and it's kind of as if the economic crisis has been normalized in their lives. Impunity is now really part of their life because they've been going through this for decades. But again, to answer your question, and I don't know if I did, these women are really survivors, and so many of them are fighting. There are incredible stories at the beginning about the doctors and the nurses who were at the forefront of the Beirut explosion and what they achieved on that day, whether it's giving birth or saving premature babies or rescuing people, etc. and etc. It's just, unfortunately, many of these women ended up leaving Lebanon, and I mentioned some of it in the book. Others are still there. They stayed behind, but I'm afraid that they're drained. Nick and I were just talking about Hiyam Qabour, who's the mom of one of the victims. And Hiyam used to go and protest every month with the families. And I was just telling Nick, he was telling me she's so vocal. I'm like, yeah, but Hiyam stopped protesting. She's so drained, she can't do this anymore. And many of these women are drained by the economic crisis, which has also taken a huge toll on them and on their daily lives.
Thanks, Dalal. You've said, I mean, you've said in your book that documenting our collective memoir is crucial for any reconciliation process, truth-seeking, or coming to terms with the past. Now, it's a step towards accountability, you add. And I'm very interested in this issue myself, but this kind of documentation was really lacking, notoriously, I should say, lacking during the Civil War, though in my view, necessary for any coming to terms with the past. And you tackle it a bit in the book, but how do you see, maybe you can talk about this, how do you see this book contributing to sort of a more inclusive or comprehensive account of events in Lebanon moving forward? And of course, how can it combat immunity, but also giving this kind of glaring absence of a kind of narrative that anyone agrees of, especially a victim-centered narrative or survivor-centered narrative?
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. I think writing or documenting a crime like that from the perspective of survivors and victims is crucial, especially in the absence of an official narrative. We did not have enough of that during the Civil War, and much of our history has been written from the perspective of the winners or those in power, or from the perspective of foreigners. Or I would say experts, historians, etc., and rarely from the perspective of ordinary citizens and Lebanese, especially victims and survivors. So I think this is the book's first and most important contribution. The second one is this is a piece of documentation. It is evidence, because these stories, these witnesses, these women have witnessed, whether it's the Beirut explosion or Lebanon's economic crisis, they've witnessed these two events, and I consider both to be crimes, because the financial crisis is also a crime against the Lebanese. And they're telling us, about this from their perspective. And so I think this documentation is a first step towards truth. And truth is a basic right for the victims and the survivors and for the Lebanese. And you need truth in order to get to accountability. There's no accountability without truth. With the absence, again, of any official work being done on documentation, it's not just this book, but it's also the crucial work of local journalists. What we know today about what happened on August 4th is very much because of the work of local journalists in Lebanon. So documentation is crucial to have some kind of truth and be able to move forward towards accountability and justice.
Do you have any specific ideas of how you would like the book used in this regard?
I think amplifying the voices in the book is a first step, so that it's not limited to the book itself. So the book turning into something else. I mean, I'm trying to explore some options here, but if there's an investigation at some point, today the families of the victims are calling, as you earlier mentioned, an impartial investigation into a fact-finding mission. Because as I said, they think truth is the first step towards accountability. And I think a lot of their stories, because they've already been written down and much of it is oral history, so as they said, it could be used as evidence. It could be used to help in the future with any investigation. The same for a lot of articles and stories that are today out in the media and have helped us shape, the narrative of what happened on August 4th, whether it's the cargo, where it came from, the ship, why the ammonium was stored, etc., and etc. I don't have a specific idea, but I would, it would be great if these stories are used in any to help in investigation. At least, I mean, it can't do more than that.
And you talk about narrative because there has been an alternative narrative, right? That is trying to kind of suffocate, the stories of survivors. But on that subject specifically, or related to that, I say the other glaring thing that I found in the stories that you highlighted is the absence, the similarly glaring absence of the state. not just in prevention and which you also document. I mean, how in taking steps to prevent the blast, but also in the recovery effort. And in contrast, this positive role that citizens, but even victims played in aid and support, it's quite incredible. The way you tell it in the story, in the stories, this kind of civic mobilization, and the role, for example, of the Red Cross, etc. And this also, we know that this also played a role in the reconstruction. Now, what can you tell us about, the state of this, civic mobilization, and how is it, from your perspective, contributing to putting pressure from below on the political class, given, their role in this?
Maybe I don't know if we want to jump to Nick. I'm not an expert because I've left Lebanon 3 years ago, but it's definitely played a role in the immediate aftermath. I mean, this is what I've seen covering the aftermath. If it weren't for citizen-led initiatives, so I'm thinking of Base Camp, for example, which I mentioned in the book, some NGOs who helped with the reconstruction. I don't think Beirut and its citizens would have, would be standing on their feet. Maybe standing on their feet is a bit too much because they're still drained by the economic crisis. But it very much helped with the reconstruction and, kind of rebuilding the city, which I think is still struggling and shattered. But it was not the government. The government is bankrupt, and there was a complete absence in the aftermath. And a lot of the women in the book speak about this, and I myself witnessed the absence of an official response in the aftermath of the explosion. So they played a crucial role, and they continue to do so. But my worry, Patricia, is that this is how it's always been in Lebanon, that the state institutions are so weak, and the NGOs have to always step in to fill in that void. And it's good maybe on the short term, but you can't build the state if it's always like this. I think on the long run, it's not healthy for a country, for a state, and for an economy. To see the private sector and the non-governmental organizations always stepping in to fill in that void. But Nick might disagree. Maybe it would be a good transition to hear from.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then I'll transition to Nick, which I believe will want to comment on everything. Yeah, let me just ask you one question that I was also interested in. You depict women as, again, victims and survivors of a system that keeps alienating them, right? But at the same time, their courage and defiance, despite, what comes out in the book as bearing the brunt of these multiple crises in the country, not just the blast, their courage and defiance are extraordinary. Now, how has this courage and defiance sort of contributed to, either a change in discourse or an actual movement in the pursuit of accountability of crimes, and how can that happen?
Oh, it's a tough question. I think we've already seen women lead the movement for change. We saw that in 2019, before the explosion, and before I wrote that book, and I mentioned it. We've seen it before in Lebanon's recent history, but again, because history is not written from that perspective, we don't know much. But today, the fight for justice is very much led by these mothers and daughters and these women. We see it when these families go and protest. We see it in the very, I would say, the little lobbying that they're trying to do. For example, Tracy Najjar is with her husband, but very much her, is leading this committee for the survivors and for the victims of August 4th to try and lobby for this Human Rights Council resolution that calls for an impartial fact-finding mission into August 4th. You have a lot of women who are leading the legal cases in the US and in the UK against Savaro and against the Geospectrum company. So the women are really at the forefront of the fight for justice, and I think their role is crucial. What they bring to the table is very different. And we've seen this in other countries and other regions, women's role as mediators and, in dialogues. Unfortunately, I think the environment in Lebanon is not very enabling. And there are two problems here. There's a structural and institutional problem that prevents women from moving forward in certain key positions, whether it's in politics or business, etc. But I also think it's the women themselves who are hindering, their progress. So I see two sides of the same coin. I think there are women pushing and some who are not pushing enough. And then I think the system itself, the political sectarian system, has made sure that women do not really go upwards in the system because it's a system not based on meritocracy. It's very much the women there are affiliated, nominated by these traditional political parties who've jeopardized the whole country and the whole system. And a lot of the political parties in power anyway don't believe in gender equality and in women's liberalization. So let's not, it's as simple as that. So, and we have very vibrant feminist movements, by the way. But again, it's what I said, there are still a lot of challenges and obstacles facing these movements. And I think the discourse needs to change. Yeah, it's a crisis, it's an economic crisis. And so people will tell you the priorities are elsewhere, but women's rights are parts of human rights and citizens' rights, and we should not divide them. It's one umbrella. And so we should not marginalize these rights and say we'll get to them later on. They all go hand in hand.
I lied when I said this was the last question to you because I want to ask a follow-up because I'm reminded also that you talked about the book being stories of women in Lebanon, not just Lebanese women, right? And so you mentioned migrants and Syrian refugees in particular. So I was wondering if you could maybe address this issue, how the blast has affected their lives and how, I mean, has it, we know their situation is quite dire. How has it impacted it in terms of shining light or otherwise? I mean, what has been the impact of the blast?
So, yeah, very briefly, before the blast, with the onset of the financial crisis, I think the problems that were already there in the migrant workers community or among the refugee community even became more apparent because of the financial crisis. So I mentioned how if, I don't know, some people are familiar with these scenes of migrant workers camping outside of their embassies in Beirut because they were basically thrown out of their, the homes where they work, not paid their salaries, told to go back home because the Lebanese families could no longer afford to have them. So things got even worse for them, although before the crisis, they were under the kafala system, which is kind of a neo-slavery labor system used in the Middle East to employ migrant workers in homes, and which I covered extensively as a journalist. And so the economic crisis just shed more light on their plight. And then here comes the explosion. And I feature the story of a migrant worker who used to clean a bank in Gemese. And she survived, like most people. She was injured. But reading her story, you can see how invisible she feels. And she kept reiterating, not to spoil the chapter, but she keeps reiterating the fact that she desperately wanted people from her community, she's Ethiopian, to be around her when she was injured, even if that means not going to a hospital and dying, because her only concern was for her to be recognizable. Nobody's going to know me. I have no passport. I have no documents. If I die, no one's going to know who I am. So this is how invisible these people feel in Lebanon. Same for refugees who were marginalized before the crisis. And then with the crisis, it got worse. Also, foreign aid was already shrinking. UN agencies were not helping them as much as before. And the Syrian community was the community with the highest number of of death among the foreign communities in Beirut on that day. So the number of Syrians that got killed was the highest among all the foreign nationalities. And you see that the struggle goes on, and they suffer from all kinds of marginalization and discrimination. And there are plenty of examples in the stories themselves in the book that shed light on that.
Thank you, Dalal. Nick, before I turn it over to you, I want to remind the audience that they can submit their questions on the Q&A function. So we will open it up for questions after, Nick provides some reactions. Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Patricia, first always for moderating the event. Thanks to the Middle East Institute and all those who organized it. And allow me to thank you, Dalal, for writing this powerful book. And for whatever it's worth, my heartfelt gratitude to the women who shared their stories. This is more than just a history. I think it is the roadmap of the future, how the future for Lebanon should look like. Now, for our audience sort of eagerly anticipating sort of getting into Q&A, I will excuse that I'll give just around 10 minutes of comments, just to sort of give a larger context to where reading this book in 2024. For nearly 5 years, Lebanon has routinely been described as a country suffering from concurrent crises. In 2019, it was hit by the worst financial and economic meltdown in its history, as well as a massive social and political uprising. In 2020, the country faced 2 new crises as the global COVID-19 pandemic spread and the devastating Port of Beirut explosion destroyed the capital, killing hundreds and forcibly displacing hundreds of thousands. In the years that followed, a country once defined by its joie de vivre has become ruled by despair. The vast majority of its people live in multidimensional poverty with limited access to basic public services like electricity and clean water. The past year has seen Lebanon navigate these national emergencies with only a caretaker government and without a president or even a central bank governor. The war in Gaza and its rapid spillover into Lebanon added one more new crisis to the country's already overwhelming calamities, an active conflict and the real and present risk of a full-scale war, pushing the country further in its long decline into a failed quasi-authoritarian state. As Lebanon adds a new category to its concurrent state of crises, there's little evidence that progress will be made in its inability to manage any of them. There can be no credible reforms without accountability for the economic meltdown, the management of the crisis, the Port of Beirut blast, and the victims of political violence. Without accountability, Lebanon will further devolve into lawlessness, serving as a haven for fugitives from justice and run by a mafia militia state sustained by a cash economy and fleeting remittances. Against the backdrop of such a tragedy, it may seem unfathomable that the situation could get even worse. Certainly, any war with Israel would be catastrophic. Even if a full-scale war can be averted. As I said, there seems to be little clarity as to how the ongoing and intensifying localized conflict will end, nor is there any indication of work being done, let alone meaningful progress, to save Lebanon from its other grueling crises, the ones that are documented and chronicled so personally in Dalal's book. On the contrary, as the many different victims of its painful history know all too well, and as the testimonies of the woman in this book highlight, these injustices risk being normalized as a new and even more dysfunctional status quo is imposed on those living in Lebanon, whether they are Lebanese, Palestinian, Syrian, or migrant workers, further denying them their core rights and quality of life. And something I would like to add to this conversation, as tempting as it is to dismiss all these problems as simply symptoms of a deep systemic failure inherent to Lebanon and the Lebanese system, and thus blame the Lebanese for not addressing these injustices that are suffocating the country. But Lebanon's descent into this quasi-authoritarian state has not happened overnight or behind closed doors. And something I appreciated from this book Indeed, despite French President Macron's assertion that the only way forward is for so-called Lebanon to change its leadership, the Lebanese have exhausted almost every democratic practice to do so. For years, they protested across sectarian and geographic divides. When those protests failed to transform the status quo, they mobilized to form alternative political parties and compete in elections, resulting in a loss of Hezbollah's majority in parliament and a historic space for alternative candidates, candidates once described as unfathomable in the Lebanese political system. Efforts to realize the 2019 popular uprising's call for a government of independent technocrats were soon met with renewed threats of violence from Hezbollah, which proceeded to form its own government regardless. I say this from Beirut. Lebanon is still not lost. Local actors within and outside government continue to fight for a stable, functional democracy, but they are fighting alone using democratic practices against a fundamentally illiberal opponent whose survival is maintained by criminality, violence, and impunity. On August 4, 2020, we saw one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history that devastated the capital. 4 years on, Hezbollah, with the support of Lebanon's political elite, has managed to obstruct and even quash the domestic judicial process for holding those responsible for the blast accountable and delivering justice to both victims and a battered nation. Politicians and security officials summoned by the judge investigating the matter not only remain at large, but continue to carry out their public functions as if nothing happened. With the domestic investigation in tatters, allow me to amplify the calls of the families of the victims towards a UN fact-finding mission to investigate the blast, sanctioning those responsible for obstructing justice, and making ending impunity the centerpiece of international mediation on the Lebanese crisis. Because the Port of Beirut blast encapsulates all that is broken about Lebanon, factors that not only led to the meltdown of 2019, but have also prevented any resolution of the crisis ever since. Unchecked militia rule, military assistance to the Syrian regime, a corrupt political class, and a bureaucracy beholden to this mafia militia, and a judiciary unable to perform its most basic functions. If the international community is serious about resolving the Lebanese crisis, it should make addressing the issue of justice and accountability for the explosion its utmost priority. When I read Dalal's book, her title hovered over every chapter, every testimonial, all she lost. It is a book that chronicles and documents what we have all lost, and that is Lebanon. Lebanon is unrecognizable. More than 4 years of unabated crisis have categorically altered the country's social and economic fabric. Again, the joie de vivre that once defined Lebanon is replaced by misery, pessimism, and despair. Deprivation is the unbearable new normal, and it affects every aspect of our lives. Depositors are deprived of their life savings, retirees from livable pensions, youth from decent jobs, and children from their basic rights. Access to basic services and goods, including food, healthcare, education, clean water, have become a luxury as prices have skyrocketed and purchasing power plummeted. Meanwhile, regular provision of essential utilities like electricity is unheard of. It is the exception that proves the rule of deprivation. Gaps in public infrastructure and services are leading to collective deprivation of these basic rights. In other words, while the scale of deprivation may not be equally shared, people in Lebanon are deprived of these basic services on a daily basis. Now, what has traditionally been labeled, and what I appreciated in Dalal's statements earlier as resilience, has become simply the degree to which individuals and households can fill the gaps by depending on external support lines like private generators, water reservoirs, or remittances. This dysfunctional adjustment to such an unbearable context is not only unsustainable, especially given the eroding infrastructure in place, it's exacerbating inequality. Those hardest hit by the crisis are unable to procure such external support lifelines, further amplifying the degree of their deprivation and leaving them with no choice but to sell household items in some cases, to desperately seek asylum. And we've seen unprecedented levels of mass migration out of the country. Now, in the few minutes I have, allow me sort of to amplify, really, with evidence, the stories we've seen. Lebanon's crisis is gendered. An earlier World Bank and UN Women Gender Assessment found that the country, and I want to state this, 75% of women are economically inactive. 75%. Women are increasingly pushed into the informal economy in a context where violence and abuse are rising, and women are left structurally unprotected. The challenges brought on by Lebanon's poor services and sinking economy are especially amplified for poor women and women in neglected regions, domestic migrant workers, refugees, sexual minorities, among other marginalized groups. In no uncertain terms, women are discriminated against in the country's laws, its economic practices, and social and practical political norms. To that point, poverty in Lebanon is not invisible. We often hear, oh, poverty is invisible. It is neglected. More than 4 years into the crisis, older people, women, primary caregivers for children or dependent family members, children and youth are being left behind. Households and individuals cannot adjust to fill the state's responsibilities. The state must prioritize the urgent building up of essential public infrastructure to ensure the integrity and access to education, healthcare, utilities, and other rights. A failed state earns its name. All of this doesn't answer the real question. Where do we go from here? Deprived of a functioning state, how long can we survive this state of deprivation? I say this again, and I will close my statements with this. I say this from Beirut: Lebanon is not yet lost. There remains, as Dalad's book so powerfully demonstrates, so many courageous believers and fighters for a country rooted in dignity. If we are to understand Lebanon's story since 2019 as fundamentally about the fight for dignity and against a system and actors that have infringed upon that dignity for decades, we must appreciate the specific and added struggles women face. It's not enough to recognize the leadership, courage, or engagement of women that keep Lebanon alive despite its multiple crises. Our collective future is incomplete if it doesn't champion and center women's rights and justice. Ultimately, such an inclusive and intersectional platform will likely, as it should, be advanced and led by Lebanese women, who have played a leading role in shaping this historic movement and made clear that the future is theirs. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Nicholas, for this impassioned intervention. I want to just pick up on this accountability theme in the context of what you discussed. And one thing you pointed out, of course, how systemic and entrenched the problems are, but you also said with a semi-hopeful kind of approach that you said on the one hand that there's no credible reform without accountability. You also called for an international investigation, right? I want to ask Dalal, do you agree? And is it enough? I mean, if there is no credible reform without accountability, I mean, is an international investigation the start of it? I mean, it's an externally pushed incentive in some ways. Like, does it satisfy the requirement of taking steps to kind of on this accountability roadmap?
I mean, I've also asked this to the families of the victims, because to be honest, there's no overwhelming consent. It's two committees versus a third one. They're divided. The political establishment has managed to also divide the survivors and the families of the victims committees, unfortunately. But this is what I hear from them, and this is what I think is, what do you do? The national investigation is completely stalled. Judge Tariq Bitar was probably doing the right thing, and this is why he's faced so many, and they're obstructing his work. But I think an international fact-finding mission is one way to revive the national investigation and to use whatever Judge Tariq Bitar has been able to find so far, and maybe revive his work one way or another. But I don't see anything else happening. And if we're going to wait for the national investigation, we might wait for many years and forever. As long as this political establishment is in power, justice is in jeopardy, and it's taken hostage by these politicians. And the families, we've had this discussion, they don't want anything that looks like the tribunal for Hariri. They want to avoid something like that. They were, people have maybe a certain reading of what happened. Some people would say the STL was useful, other not. I don't want to go into there, but they think a fact-finding mission is easier, and it's a first step, and at least they would know what happened, and then they would know who to blame. And it would come from what they want, which is an impartial, independent mission. And so ideally, it's not tainted by any interference. Yeah, I mean, no one wants foreign interference and something from abroad. But then when you look internally, what is it that you are able to do? There's no internal solution at this point. They were so hopeful, and a lot of the families speak highly of Judge Tariq Bitar, but they know that he can't do much anymore. And this to them and to me is the only way forward for now, is finding out what happened through this independent mission.
And Dalal, also another question that comes to mind, like in transitional justice processes, or at least in coming to terms with such tragic events, I mean, we talk about reparations. And clearly, I mean, there is a need. I mean, reading your book, if anything, gives you a kind of sense of the scale and the depth of the damage that was done, right? And so, and it's just a slice, by the way. It's just a slice, right? And so, has there been any talk of reparations? Has there been any, any discussion about that?
I mean, there's the compensation you get from the government, from the army. This we already have or heard of. It's very minimal. Some of it has not been paid. By the way, this is a corrupt and completely bankrupt government. So what can we expect? But I think it's too soon to talk about reparations when we don't exactly know what happened and who is responsible. And reparation is very much part of that, of justice and of the process. But and as you say, like, people have been suffering for decades. So I think, unfortunately, the truth and reconciliation, if it ever happens, cannot start on August 4th, 2020. Also, there are so many past grievances that have not been addressed that keep coming back. And this is why, in my own opinion, the civil war never ended in Lebanon. We're still living through the repercussions and the continuation of the war. We reached kind of a truth in 1990. But there are structural problems, and I think truth and reconciliation is far from being achieved. We need that before we can talk about any kind of reparation.
Do you agree, Nick?
About which aspect? Just to be clear, because there was a lot to unpack.
The feasibility of truth and reconciliation.
Look, what I've tried to communicate first, again,
I asked because you're more optimistic in general. So
yeah, so what I've tried to communicate is that Lebanon's struggle and its fight for justice, and so from there, when we speak of truth and reconciliation, is no longer simply just a local one. And I don't want to take away agency here, but my point is the collective crises it's facing have become rooted in dealing with an obstruction that has allowed to survive, not because of the absence of reconciliation, right? Not because of sectarianism, but because of political violence and coercion. And for me, this deserves its attention. But forget what I'm saying. When you read, and where I encourage the readers of this book, the lucid commentary, the critique that comes from so many of these women points to the very complex struggles that Lebanon faces. And there was a section here that said, we've tried, right? We've done this. We've faced through these things. And it's powerful because I do, I just want to, in 1 minute, where I appreciate Dalal brings in her book, it doesn't shy away from the difficult questions, right? Yes, there is political failure, there are systemic failures, but how do you deal with the elephant in the room, which is an armed actor? What tools do ordinary people have against armed actors? And that's a powerful, for me, a takeaway.
And many of the women bring this up naturally without any fear, although, they're in Lebanon, they mention Hezbollah. And even because we're talking about the explosion, and I think I agree with you, this has a regional and international dimension. This was not an incident or an accident, in my own opinion, and based on the evidence that we have. But this is where I think knowing the truth is very important, to know that, this elephant in the room, along with maybe other international and regional actors, is a problem. And our problems, yes, are not only internally. And I think in the historical chapter, I call Lebanon a dysfunctional compromise. And I talk about how we've had to compromise internally and externally again and again because of, these regional dynamics, and Lebanon being a proxy again and again. So I completely agree with you.
Rookie mistake, yeah. Let me ask you again the question. This comes from the audience, the question that I asked you in the beginning, which is when we were just preparing for the webinar. How is it that you, again, writing these stories, which are incredibly tough and moving, can you share a bit about your own psychological struggles that you faced when interviewing so many women who hadn't been able to deal with their own trauma? Like, how do you handle their trauma on top of your own?
Yeah, I saw that question, and thank you, Tasha, for asking. It's been a tough journey, and I was just telling Patricia that, and I mentioned this in the book, I suffered from insomnia following the summer, where I did the bulk of the research and the interviews with the women. I always have a delayed processing mechanism, so when I'm embedded in the work, and shortly afterwards I'm fine, but then it hits me later on. But as a journalist, we're exposed to these kind of stories a lot. And I worked with refugees for 4 years with UNHCR. I was a video producer for the UN. And I now have a kind of a coping mechanism, because this is very much part of what I do. And I went through therapy for 2 years, and I learned how to process these stories and these feelings and how they impact me. I have to live with them. They're going to be part of what I do as long as I do what I do. But I got better at just dealing with them. They still hurt me. And I think the Beirut explosion, as I said earlier, was the toughest assignment in my career as a journalist, because it was so personal. It affected my city. It affected people that I loved. I lost people that I knew. Family and relatives were injured, or their homes were destroyed. And my own life turned upside down. I moved to Paris because of what happened on that day. But I think really the hardest part was sitting down for these interviews. It's a burden, because a lot of these women share their stories for the first time with me. And I'm not a psychologist. I was trained to interview trauma survivors, but I had to very carefully craft my questions and make sure I'm not triggering them again. And yet there were so many women who were not ready. And I talk about this in the book, and you'll see this if you read it. It was a very privileged, but at the same time, delicate position that I was in, to sit there for hours and to listen to the stories. A lot of them, most of them, cried all the time. And it took an emotional toll on me, where I couldn't just be the journalist sitting and listening. I often cried as well. And there's a relationship that I built with most of these women that I'm still in touch with, by the way. And I think this is a book that goes beyond my work as a journalist. And if you read it, you'll see that it's a very personal one.
Dalal and Nick, we're at time. So I want to thank you. And before I thank you, I want to thank you both to have been to have been part of this conversation and to have made me part of this conversation. But before I say goodbye and a final thank you, I want to make sure that Dalal, all she lost, the proceeds of the book go to the survivors, correct? Can you
My
just
part,
say something
yeah, my
about
part
that?
only,
Yes.
not the publisher's part. Yeah, it says at the end of the book, it goes to the most vulnerable women in the book, which I'm already kind of assisting and helping those left behind. Yes, thank you.
So I just want to make sure this gets out, and I encourage everybody who joined us today to get the book and read the book. It's quite an incredible product. Thank you, Dalal. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Middle East Institute.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Nick, both of you,
Thank
for
you.
this valuable contribution.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for logging in.